G'day and welcome to the Driving Talk podcast in association with Icon. And I am here today with special guest Scott Woodwiss. And this week is a very, very special week. It's Bathurst week. This weekend, one of the greatest races in motorsport, the greatest race, as it is known as, happens down under. We are talking, of course, of the Bathurst 1000. Scott, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on to talk about this momentous race.
I appreciate it, Rob. All good. And yeah, there's not many races that can top Bathurst. I'm someone who does enjoy a good Bathurst whenever I get the chance to see it. And my sort of motorsport education involved a handful of Bathursts in terms of on videotapes. I'm sure we'll get to those at some point in this podcast. But yeah, it's a pretty special race. It's a circuit which you have things like the Nürburgring and Le Mans and other great circuits, but there's some people who will classify Bathurst as the best circuit in the world just because of what it is, what it represents, the kind of racing it produces, just the whole spectacle of it all, and just the way in which it produces an event that arguably Australians or fans of the series or fans of touring car racing will say that no other produces.
No.
I mean, yes, Le Mans and Indy and other places like that have their own spectacles, but Bathurst is one of those that's truly unique in its nature. And for the circuit that it is, the racing it provides, the kind of racing, the kind of people that you have there, and just the whole atmosphere and the history of what it is and what it represents.
And apart from Pikes Peak, it's the only race where you literally climb a mountain.
Yeah.
And there is nothing like going into turn one and going up the mountain on lap one, whether it's Chevrolet and Ford these days, but historically Ford versus Holden, or in 1987, Ford against the Stewards. But I'm sure we'll come to that when we talk about the historic races of Bathurst. But let's talk about 2024. I know we were speaking off air just before. You're not as clued up on the supercars this year, just because you've been flat out doing lots of great things for the BRSCC and Driven Minds. Incidentally, folks, don't forget to check out Scott Woodwiss's social media work for that. He does some great work and does fantastic work for the British Racing and Sports Car Club. But really, we're looking at three drivers going into this year's race. We've got two Chevrolets and Ford, Will Brown, Chaz Mozzie and Brock Feeney. That's the top three in the championship. And as well as being its own fantastic 1,000-kilometre race, this is a round of the championship too. So, you know, the stakes are so high, aren't they, Scott?
Yeah, it's interesting when you look at the history of the race. Bathurst always used to be literally an end-of-season race. It used to be the entire championship would be settled, and then by about the sort of September, October time, it'll be all. You'd have the Enduros, you'd have the Sandown 500, and then you go straight into Bathurst, and pretty much that was the end of the season. The only other racing that you'd probably have is when it was the end of the season, you'd have them doing the Australian Grand Prix support at Adelaide. Those times, but in terms of this season, in terms of where it's been, I mean, obviously it's no surprise to see the drivers that are at the front of the standings being up there, given the caliber that they are.
Well, you got
the likes of Brock Feeney, Will Brown, and co in the mix.
Yeah, and Cam Waters just tucked in behind there as now in the monster Ford, and Matt Payne as well. He's been a real revelation this year, and I would kind of put him as an outsider in the Penrite Mustang as well. But all of the Ford guys, unfortunately, you've probably seen it, even if you haven't been keeping as a touch as I have. The Ford teams are really going into this race quite worried about reliability. They've had all the engine issues at the Sandown 500 and at the ride day on the Monday afterwards, and there's rumours of parts being shipped across to the likes of Japan and then down to Australia to then get built by Moztec, which is the Ford engine builder, and then being put into the cars at Bathurst. So you've got the likes of Chaz Mozzie, Cam Waters, Matt Payne, not only going for championship honours, or certainly in Chaz Mozzie's case, go for championship honours. They want to win the Bathurst 1000. And, as you'd have seen in the past few years, Scott, the Bathurst 1000 is really now a sprint race over 6 hours. There's no holding off like in the old days that we would have seen when the likes of Larry Perkins and Peter Brock won it, where you kind of had a manic few laps, took a bit of a break in the middle, and then just gunned it towards the end. So really, that's going to be the intrigue, I feel, for this race this year. Can the Ford teams even make it to the end, let alone win that race?
Yeah, I remember at the start of when these regs came in that there was a bit of disparity in that they felt that, correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was either the Fords were quicker than the Chevys or the other way around.
The Chevys were very quicker than the Fords.
And there was a bit of disparity in terms of the 4 teams were almost up in arms thinking, well, hold on a minute, sure, there has to be some parity here, because why are the Chevrolets running away with it and practically taking all the podiums and every single victory out there, and why are we stuck lagging out there? And so I think there was some, forgive any ignorance on this one, I should have followed it more than I have done, but in terms of, I know there was a bit of like some parity brought in, particularly on the aero side, and also I think to do with something to do with the engines where they balanced them a bit better. And even this weekend,
I mean they got it ready for this year. So this year has been a straight out fight between Chevrolet and Ford. There's perhaps been a little bit of a suggestion at times that Ford have perhaps got a bit too much parity in the bag now, as they've got some great results. But yeah, since Gen 3 has come in, it's been all over the place. But we've never really seen an issue with reliability as much, except in the first early days when the Fords had a slight heating issue in that they like to catch fire. That was very quickly rectified. And last year's Bathurst 1000 was it was a bit of a procession, which is kind of a good thing, kind of a bad thing. The Fords and the Chevrolets worked, and we ended up with our winners as Shane Van Gisbergen and Richie Stanaway before SVG headed off to go and race some NASCAR. Incidentally, doing very well in that, isn't he? So it's all to play for this year. I mean, Richie Stanaway's now gone from a Chevrolet into a Ford, but again, he's going to be behind the wheel of his Penrite Racing Mustang with a point to prove with no drive next year as the reigning Bathurst champion, the only one on the grid. But he's in a Ford, so he's going to be going halfway up the straight thinking, is this going to let go? Because his car went in the Sandown 500, just locked up. So he's going to have that in the back of his mind as well. So much intrigue for this race.
There is as well, and just looking at some of the storylines going into the weekend, I've also noticed that one of the key ones is that there's been a tyre compound change for this weekend's race as well, because rather than racing on the soft tyre, they reverted to what they did back at the season opening, the Bathurst 500, the season opener, the shorter Bathurst race, which if there's such a thing is, I mean, who can complain if you're a supercars fan when you get 2 races at Bathurst, regardless of what length it's...
Yeah, the problem is the racing wasn't as great in the opening race at Bathurst. It kind of... And I kind of felt it as well. The racing at the opening round wasn't as... It just didn't have the magic that a 1000 has. I mean, my personal opinion, there should be one Bathurst every year in the Supercars Championship, and it's got to be the 1000. So luckily, next year, obviously it ties in with the calendar news, they've taken the double Bathurst round out, so it's going to have just the 1000. But yeah, that tyre compound as well, fantastic news with that. And maybe that's going to play to the strategy of the teams a bit more as well. They could tweak a little bit more with it. The other thing as well, the full course yellow rules that came in. Sandown kind of gave us a few issues in that full course yellow came out, and they gave all of the teams the opportunity to go and make a pit stop before they switched off the full course yellow. So it didn't really change anything on the strategy. They've changed that for this round. That's going to add to it too, I feel. What do you reckon?
Usually when you have any kind of full course yellow rules, it does like to mix things up a little bit, particularly. And if you want to use, we can use a local example, which is C1s, for example. When we have a full course, a safety car, essentially, we feel that's equivalent of in the UK, with a full course yellow, pretty much. We don't have code 60s or I've only seen British GT use that, but used to use the example, if you pit under the safety car, you get a 6-minute penalty, so because you're gaining an advantage. So obviously that was done for safety reasons, in terms of even looking at when they had it before, looking at the with the safety car rules. I mean, going back to the tyre thing, I was saw the fact that last year's Bathurst race, they ran it on the soft tyre, and Shane Van Gisbergen got caught up by, I think, a massive clump of rubber at the cutting, which essentially derailed his chance of winning the race. So I think it will help in terms of tyre life. It will help in terms of them managing it better. And given the fact that there was a better experience on the hard tyre in the 500 at the start of the year, that will certainly please the teams, knowing that the tyre can go the distance and it shouldn't give them too much grief. In terms of those full course yellow rules, I think it would just be down to literally gamesmanship and who can play the rule the better in terms of it. There'll always be the luck of the draws. There always is when you throw a safety car or a full course in any form of motorsport. But given a circuit like Bathurst, knowing how hard it can hit and knowing how quickly just things can change like that in Bathurst, we know over the years, those kind of rules are certainly going to make it very key for teams to be on their toes, particularly when something happens and thinking, right, if this pits, do we wait until the full course yellow comes out and everyone's stacked up, or do we do it now so that we can be in a better position and stay out and gain track position that way? That's going to be a real So it might cause a bit of a headache in terms of strategy, in terms of which direction do you go? Do you pit when everyone's behind the safety car to make it kind of slightly more of an even playing field so that you're not gaining time, or do you make the obvious choice in some cases and literally, as I say, pit when the safety car as soon as it's called, or in anticipation, so that you leapfrog everyone whilst they're in the pit lane? But of course, under safety car rules, they're going to not lose as much time when they make that pit stop. It'll all be free pit stops for everyone.
And you've got this lucky dog rule as well. So if you do get into strife early on, I believe it's under safety car, they're able to gain the laps back that they potentially lose, which to me kind of, it takes the jeopardy out of the endurance race. It's, it's almost, I've heard the term communist racing. It's almost a bit like that. You can't go too far with it. I mean, I'm all for making a fair game for everyone, Scott, but I don't know. I'm a bit, the lucky dog rule, I don't know, it just doesn't quite sit right with me. Other stories up and down the pit lane. James Courtney, Jack Perkins, they're back in the Blanchard Racing Mustang as well. James Courtney heading towards the end of his full-time career. And that makes me feel old, because I can remember James Courtney when he raced British Formula 3. And he was bloody good in that. And then he went to test for Jaguar in F1, and then famously, he had a shunt at Monza, and that really ended his career in F1 before he then headed back home and headed to supercars. And I think his manager is still Alan Gow. Alan has not sacked him yet. That's astonishing. So I wonder if perhaps Mr. Gow has left Brands Hatch this weekend and popped across to Bathurst to witness a great race. Who knows?
Wouldn't surprise me. I mean, they've got some interesting young teammates I can see here in Aaron Love and Aaron Cameron. So
yes,
two relatively upcoming drivers in the mix. Of course, you got the name Perkins in as well, and Jack Perkins. He's been doing, I think, admittedly a lot more on the TV side, presenting side for the coverage rather than being.
But in Super 2
recently,
in
Super 2,
yeah, he's been an absolute gun in Super 2 over the years as well. I think he's been doing a bit of Trans Am stuff as well, so he's been keeping his eye in.
He has been keeping his eye in, yeah.
Do not discount Jack Perkins, I think, on his day. And you talk about the co-drivers, Scott. I mean, it's Sandown. It went crazy as soon as all the main drivers started the race as per the new rules. Stupid. But, as soon as the co-drivers got in, all hell broke loose. And he's in one of the cars, the main cars this weekend. He is going to have a point to prove. But I'm going to put myself on a limb here, and I'm going to put my hat in the ring and think that Scott Pye is going to do the job for Triple Eight Race Engineering with Will Brown. There's been a lot of conjecture recently around Sandown as well. He's been making some comments on his podcast, the Apex Hunters United podcast, that have been quite feisty, talking of censorship and things like that. And to be fair, when you listen to his points that he's got, he makes a very good point. He's very articulate. He's a smart guy, Scott Pye, and he's a fantastic race car driver. There's been a bit of pushback from that as well, I might add. But I think he's going to come into Bathurst. They won Sandown. And he's like, you know what? I want to get this. That would be the brilliant way to make your point proven. Moved on from Team 18 last year. Behind the wheel of a Triple Eight Chevrolet. I've got to put him as one of the favourite for this race. Overwhelming.
Well, you look at the entire lineup for Red Bull Ampol Racing anyway. You got Will Brown, who's proven himself not just in supercars but other areas of motorsport.
Yep.
I think I'm correct. He was a TCR Australia champion.
Yeah.
And that was him before.
But basically anything, just raced anything and won in it.
Yeah, and I think he's done some. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I've caught a handful of their races this year, but I think he's done a tiny bit of GT racing in Australia as well.
Yeah.
So it's quite an interesting. It's quite interesting. On a very brief but slight side tangent, it's very interesting how Australia's motorsport scene is when you get. It's very much like racing of old, how it used to be, where rather than just one driver sticking to one championship, the Australians in particular do like to move around and do multiple campaigns in multiple different championships at the same time. It's very much like how the old school F1 drivers were of like the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, where they were going to do multiple sort of stuff. So it's interesting how that dynamic, and it must be tied into how the economy is over there, that they can obviously are able to put those campaigns together and have the investment from sponsors and teams and what have you. But yeah, in terms of Will's ability, that's unquestionable. The fact he's in a top car in the Red Bull Ampol team that makes him able to showcase that talent is good. Scott Pye's always been magnificent. And then you got the other car where you got the young gun in Brock Feeney's team with arguably one of the greatest supercar drivers of all time,
Jamie Winkel. Yeah, the GOAT.
So that quartet as a whole I mean, whatever combination you put those 4 drivers in, you'd have to say unquestionably that whatever combination ended up in, it could be, I don't know, Will Brown and Jamie Whincup. That would unquestionably be a favourite for the race. You then look at some of the other ones further down. I mean, you've got Cam Watson, James Moffat, Thomas Randall's always been pretty quick as well in the Fords. And then another wild card, which I'll be very intrigued to see what happens. I think that still has something of a loose connection to the Red Bull one, is technically correct me if I'm wrong, the third car in the equation, which is the Triple Eight race.
Craig Lowndes and Cooper Murray,
one of the other goats. Yeah, Cooper Murray. And he's, I'm sure, got plenty left in him that he can still make an impact because he knows his place well and knows it from his good old mentor, Peter Brock.
Yeah, well, they had the Drivers Only podcast recently with Craig was on, and they talked about Sandown. They finished 5th. They had an amazing run, and Cooper Murray is a great little rookie driver in that. It's a super cheap auto entry. Obviously, the Supercars coverage will try their absolute best not to have that car on the coverage for obvious reason, it being the Repco Supercars Championship. But again, having that third Triple Eight race engineering wildcard and getting those youngsters through is absolutely fantastic because the likes of Brock Feeney, he was on that wildcard with Russell Ingall, who came back and made an appearance a few years ago. You know, it was the Enforcer and the Kid wildcard. Great days, and you know, Triple Eight race engineering, super cheap auto, putting up that wildcard and getting another youngster through the ranks. I can't ignore Richie Stanaway in that Ford Mustang with Dale Wood. Premier Racing have really come up trumps recently. They've got some great results. They've got their first podium. They finished on the podium at the Sandown 500. James Golding, David Russell has got form. He always finishes well at Bathurst. He's always on the podium. And we've spoken about all of these drivers, gone through most of these teams. We still haven't spoken about Garth Tander, who's partnering with Matt Payne in the Penrite Racing Mustang. You know, Garth Tander, multiple Bathurst winner very recently with Triple Eight. And we haven't even spoken about the reigning champion, who of course had the issues earlier this year, missed the first couple of rounds. Brodie Kostecki is in the number 1 Erebus Motorsport Camaro with Todd Hazelwood. That's surely got to be a really strong favourite for the race as well. He wants to win that before he goes off to Shell V-Power Racing, surely.
Yeah, and it'll be a nice way to round things off when we looked, of course, at the beginning of the season when there was all the drama about, Brodie leaving Erebus and then all the sponsors disappearing and then the car coming back and looking very different to how it was last year. Of course, last year it was red and black. This year it started the season being white and black with a bit of yellow on it from a random sponsor because they were trying to pick stuff up because Coca-Cola and all the different sponsors. I think there's probably an element that still doesn't know exactly everything that transpired, what was going on between Erebus and Brodie at that point, but clearly there's been elements that have made it better.
I think there's been a lot of litigation tying up the real news coming out, and perhaps Barry Ryan being a little bit careful with who he speaks to in the press. He certainly had a war of words with the likes of Speed Cafe as well. So I won't say anything on here in case I get sent a letter through. But yeah, certainly there's been a few issues that looks like they've been straightened out later on the year, or would appear so. But again, you've got a driver, the reigning champion, and a driver of that caliber in Brodie Kostecki in the number 1 Camaro. Chaz Mozzie as well. Chaz Mozzie and Cam Waters, a pair of Mustangs, different teams, WAU and Tickford Racing. But what happens now with WAU? We've seen the news that they are going to be the new Toyota team in 2026. Will that actually scupper them for the race because they're going to have a lot more media attention around them now? And Ford Performance aren't going to go 100% in with it. I know they're contracted. They're still a Ford team at the moment. But surely if you're Ford Performance, you're kind of going to go, well, if you're leaving us soon anyway, they're not going to be as, I don't know, call me a skeptic. I just think that could harm Chaz Mozzie's title push and his call for the race.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting storyline. Of course, there's one of the news stories on the website is 5 key storylines coming into the weekend, and they've picked that out as one of them in that side. And it's interesting, Ryan Walkinshaw has said publicly that the team's focus is remaining on continuing the success, continuing with Ford, because they know that's when the contract runs out. They're still obviously working together with each other. But I can understand in a way if Ford decide to have a think over the winter and go, do you know what? No disrespect to them, but ultimately, they are moving on. So therefore,
we're not going to give them as much support.
Well, it's not so much support, but they might throw more behind, Cam Waters and maybe around the other teams in the mix and Tickford and others who obviously run forward cars on the field in order to kind of strengthen their run. At the same time, though, if I don't understand the position in terms of they're leaving, so they want to be a bit cautious. But at the same time, surely Ford would still want to have all their teams as successful as possible. So kind of almost defaulting a bit on one of their teams just because they're switching manufacturers, it doesn't seem quite right. When they're still, as in any contract, they're still your client. They're still in partnership with you until the end of 2025. So therefore, Ford shouldn't have an issue, or shouldn't, in my opinion, maybe I'm thinking about it as more the good guy side rather than it's just business. But I think that Ford should still throw their weight behind every team they've got.
Yeah.
And rather than thinking, oh, well, they're leaving, so we'll secretly give them a little less effort and give the others a little bit more. Where it's, particularly knowing the caliber of team that it is, you want the best, all your teams to be up there with the best possible chance, respectively, to win races, get podiums, win the championship. If you're purposely almost hindering one of them, I don't see who that benefits of anyone. Just allow them to at least get you, if they put their weight behind Walkinshaw still in the way that they are with everyone else, give them a chance to give you one last title so that you can go in and say, look, yeah, you might be leaving for Toyota, but you still got the title with a Ford. So that says a lot in terms of they might be leaving, but one, they're a good caliber team, and two, they can get it done in the Mustang. So can any other teams that might come across and switch. They did it, so why can't you?
Absolutely. Well, I think that just about sums up a bit of a preview for the 2024 edition of Bathurst. But I think it's time now for us to put on our rose-tinted glasses and just look at some of the epic battles and to basically talk about what this race means to us, why we love this race so much, and some of the historic Bathurst races we've had in the past. It happens every year. You have the replay of the races coming up online. And for us, Scott, we're based in the UK, so we don't get to see it. It's on the bucket list. I probably won't be able to get to it next year, but I'm definitely looking at it the year after. I have been pricing up tickets and flights. I'm going to go. It's going to be one of those. I've got to go out to it. But what stands out for you in the past? What are those Bathurst races that really mean something to you?
Well, for me, being born in 1990, the ones where you had the glory days of Brock and Johnson and the Rock in 1981, that was all before my time. So my first Bathurst, quite literally, was 1990, and even then, it wasn't on terrestrial TV.
No.
It was via videotape, and my education in motorsport was via an ever-increasing collection of motorsport VHSs that either my dad bought or got from, I think, where he worked in a day dealership where I think it was in partnership with Halford somewhere, and they had like a little rack that was full of motorsport. That was in the days when Halford sold that kind of stuff, like motorsport.
Yes, because I used to get the BTCC videos from those same racks.
Exactly. So it was pretty much from that, and I don't know where he got these particular ones from, but there was the old blue and white sports scene videos.
Yeah,
one or two of them which you can still get if you get. This is not an advert, of course, but if you go onto Jig Video, you can still find that stuff on there, and all different Bathursts and even Australian touring cars. And it was the first my first exposure to Bathurst and to any kind of Australian racing was two videotapes, both in 1990. It was the 1990 Australian Touring Car Championship review. So that was the first time I got to see and learn names like Dick Johnson, Jim Richards, Peter Brock, Tony Longhurst, John Bow,
Alan Grice,
Win Percy, those kind of guys, Neil Crompton, all those different guys, Glenn Seaton, all those guys. That was the first time I kind of got to know those. And then on top of that, there was Bathurst. On top of that was the separate tape. And that, of course, was the first year in which the machine they call Godzilla made its debut. Obviously, there'd been Nissan Skylines previously, but this was the first year of the GTR. It had, if I remember correctly, it had brake problems in practice and qualifying, so it didn't make the top 10 shootout. Richards only needed a handful of laps to eventually blast past Jim Richards, who'd taken the lead. And that car lasted well enough until I think he had some kind of a turbo issue or something that made it sort of slow down and be a bit steamy or a bit smoky. And they eventually did finish, I think, somewhere near the top 10. But I didn't realise it at the time in terms of when you look back at that race and look at the fact that the GTR was expected to be the dominant force. the Sierras were getting towards their swan song, given that we'd come out of the 80s and we're now into all the 90s, and we were heading towards the end of Group A, whether we knew it or not, because the 2-litre formula was starting to take shape. That was the first year in the UK it was taking shape.
Yeah.
In 1990, when it was streamlining it down from 4 classes to 2. But Group A was still very much the flavour in touring cars all the way until 1992, when the big sort of 5-litre V8 bangers came back and set the seeds for what we have now. Just back to proper Holden versus Ford, and you can throw in Nissan and Volvo along the way on top of that, and Mercedes-Benz. But yeah, 1990 was the first exposure I had at Bathurst, and then I was able to later on look at 91 and particularly 92. It is also quite an entertaining one. It was the last one for Group A.
Well, everyone will just remember it. It'll be the massive accident that then happened on the track. It was then the podium celebrations afterwards, where a lot of people won't realise this. Neil Crompton went out after getting 3rd place in the sister Skyline and wound up the crowd, and I think he gave him the finger. And then Johnson and Bauer went out onto the podium in 2nd place and basically said, "I don't get it. How could a crash car win Bathurst?" Which, of course, was the number 1 car of Mark Scaife and Jim Richards. And if you listen to all of the interviews since, the best bit was Mark Scaife turned around and went, "Oh yeah." Jim Richards basically turned around and went, "Oh, don't worry. You don't do anything stupid, mate. You just keep yourself to yourself." And then he goes out and calls the massive crowd a pack of arseholes. That's brilliant. In the most, I mean, he was a Kiwi and he did it. That was probably the most Australian thing you could do in any form of racing. So,
yeah. And Scaife even said, I remember he said, I've been racing for a while, and this is like the most unbelievable thing I've experienced. I won't forget this for the rest of my life. He didn't like insult them, but he pretty much said, "Look, I can't believe that Australian fans, I thought they were better than this." But and then Jamie Chin came out with the fact,
this is bloody disgraceful. You're a pack of
yes. He came out with the legendary line, and now it's now in not just Bathurst folklore, but Australian motorsport folklore, that particular side. But yeah, and that was an interesting ending in terms of how it was, and at that point with the GTRs, at that point they were very much, they were trying to restrict the power a lot. They were trying to give them a heck of a lot of weight to try and offset the fact they were just so quick.
I think it was something like 1,600 kilos or something was their minimum weight. I don't know if you ever used to watch the old videos with the who was the head of Nissan Motorsport at that time, who built the cars?
Fred Gibson.
That's it. So Freddie Gibson said even the lower arms they filled with lead to get the weight down. To get the minute, to obviously they had to weigh the cars down, but the fact that they had hollow arms and they still filled them with lead so they could at least get the weight down on the car. And I'm hearing stuff like that, and I'm just like, wow, this is unreal.
It's some people might argue that the Skyline GTR was the car that killed Group A because of how quick it was. It's just simply just taking advantage of what the rule set was, and ultimately producing a car which I guess is one of those homologation specials in a way, in terms of they built it so that I don't think it was necessarily initially intended to become a touring car, but obviously Nissan created a good base which they could use then to make it into a solid racing car, which they did. And so that car, even with the weight it had and the restrictions they were trying to place on it, it was still competitive and still had the edge over the later Ford Sierras that Dick Johnson built, with the still 600 of brake horsepower going through the rear wheels. There was the Holdens that were still doing their thing, but maybe in some cases were competitive, others were not. And then you also had the little bit that had as Mike Raymond called them, the beautiful BMWs, the BMW M330s, which are great looking cars. But I think it's safe to say, because they were naturally aspirated and only reworked on certain tight and twisty tracks, and even places like some of the special end of season races, I'm thinking like the street races in places like Adelaide, and also particularly Wellington in New Zealand as well, when those cars were pretty much better because they were tight and on the tighter, twistier.
Yeah.
Circuits that didn't require tons of power, or having lots of power wasn't an advantage. Those cars would just eat up the corners as the M3 would. I want to quickly flip back to 1990, because that was I didn't realise it was quite a significant win, because of course that was the win where we had Alan Gryson win Percy.
But the VL Commodore.
In an aging VL Commodore, because it was the next year they brought in the VN, and that was okay for a couple of seasons before the VP Commodore came in for the for the 93 season with the V8, and that debuted at Bathurst in 92. And I didn't realise how significant it was because, that all season up to that point, and that car had been around for what? This is like the 5th season with that car had been around. And it had moments, but both the factory team and then, Larry Perkins had gone out and done a couple of decent results in it here and there and where he could. But those cars were known not necessarily for being quick on the sprint races, but they were good to be quick on the endurance races when they could last distance. And the V8 was a bit more trusting, a bit more reliable maybe than some of the turbo Sierras and even of course the Skylines, because those cars were of course naturally aspirated, so they weren't as temperamental as some of the turbo cars were. And of course, Wimphurst and Alan Grice knew each other from ironically racing for Nissan towards the end of the 80s. So there was a partnership there, and ultimately it was a surprise win, but one that was incredibly popular. And that race for me not only cemented the Skyline and things like the RS 500, but it also made me fall in love with the VL SS Group A Commodore as well, because it was a race-winning car and it sounded great. It looked a bit boxy, but it still looked like a neat little saloon car, race car from what it was, with a thumping V8 in it. It was just a really feel-good story, and unfortunately they couldn't follow it up in 91 and 92, and the GTR kind of ruled the day in that sense. But those are my first initial memories, watching 91, 92 years later after first watching 90. But that's my memories. In some cases, others are looking back in their history and more of a 70s person. When you looked at the Ford Falcons and like Alan Moffat and those guys coming into the mix. And then there was the Brock years through the 80s and maybe the late 70s as well on top of that. So that was all before my time, but I can certainly respect and appreciate those times. So but for me, mine was very much the 90s Group A turbos and the Holden Commodore, which beat everyone against the odds, which was always quite memorable for me.
So obviously you talk about a V8 winning 1990 Group A touring cars, and for me, the era of V8 supercars is one thing that's really put the icing on the cake for Bathurst. I mean, we can't not mention Peter Brock's historic 9 wins. I mean, to be fair, before we go on to the V8 era, we've got to talk about 1987 as well. I was listening to an old podcast from V8 Sleuth the other day, and he spoke about the Sierras obviously winning it on the road. And apparently there was a sort of an unspoken agreement in the World Touring Car paddock of, okay, well, we won't. And there was a famous broadcast by Neil Crompton where he spoke about the jungle juice of the Ford Sierras, and the FIA delegates came down and tested the fuel, and it blew it through the roof. But apparently the local teams that were racing at Bathurst, like Frank Gardner's operation at the time, they didn't read the unwritten rule book about protesting other cars. So straight away, as soon as they saw how slightly bent the Sierras were, Frank Gardner's team put in a protest, and that won the race for Peter Brock in a car that they didn't reckon would finish.
Well, I think the interesting thing is that, if I remember correctly, is that they were initially pulled up on the fuel issue.
Yes.
They were pulled up on the fuel issue, and I think some way, somehow, they were cleared of it, or something. It was inconclusive whether they were cleared. What they were actually disqualified on, if I remember correctly,
it's the wings. The wheel arches.
It was the wheel arches. They were the front or rear wings. The wheel arches were, or the trim around those was actually illegal on that side. But what I also remember of that as well is that there's a clip somewhere as well where on broadcast, I think it's Mike Raymond and whoever's talking about it, and they actually basically call out the FIA and basically say that in terms of we were told that we were going to do this process, it'll all be the local stuff that we do, they respect it, and then they turned around on Friday and said, no, we're going to do it this way, we're going to do it that way to the FIA, and they actually called out the FIA and the governing body, saying, look, this is ridiculous, the fact that this has been put in place, or things have put in place to disadvantage the local teams, to kind of not give them a fair chance against some of the World Touring Car teams. It's all been done, and I think they're effectively saying, thank God when this race is over, because we can just get rid of this being a World Touring Car round, and we'd never have to deal with them again. Because the one thing also that was significant about that race too is that we know Bathurst being a standing start.
Yeah.
That was in World Touring Cars, they always do rolling starts. That was the first ever rolling start for a Bathurst, I think, ever, and I think it's the only one that's ever taken place. So it was interesting how the Australians didn't like how the FIA were doing it. The FIA came and said, right, we're going to do it the World Touring Car way. And
no.
yeah, basically Aussies were like, nah, mate, you're all right. And they just didn't agree with it. And so I think that I'm certain they're probably quite relieved when they found out the World Touring Cars 88 wasn't happening. So they can go, right, we can go back to our rules, back to our regular racing. We don't have to worry about all these
all those ingrates coming over and spoiling the fun.
Yeah, all the overseas drivers and teams coming across in the World Championship and kind of spoiling the event for in their eyes, spoiling it for all the locals and all the regular teams.
Yeah, but going from the Group A era, like I was saying, into the V8 supercars, I mean, some absolutely memorable moments in there. There's one that's an absolute favourite of both of ours, and we've both put it up on we both put it up on our stories recently. I'm going to send you to 2003, and the top 10 shootout is always a memorable part of every weekend. But this weekend in particular was going to go down in history. It was known as the Lap of the Gods. And after disappointment in the 2002 race, where, of course, we had the 5-minute penalty for Greg Murphy because of a pit stop infringement. So you had everything around. Obviously, you had the fuel pouring out onto the pit lane. He got given a 5-minute penalty. And he famously got out of his car during the penalty and went into the dunny that was in the garage. So during the 2003 on the broadcast, like leading up to it, they had this radio-controlled dunny going around with Kmart all over it, really making a thing of what happened in 2002. But Greg Murphy gets in the car that he would share with Rick Kelly to do the shootout, and he did what is labelled to this day as the Lap of the Gods. Scott, talk us through it.
Yeah, and obviously suffix it by saying, yes, there have been faster laps, but this one, given the circumstances and the speeds that they were able to achieve, the lap times they were able to achieve.
With a H pattern?
With a H pattern gearbox, yeah. Not whereas these days it's still the stick, or I think at one point they were looking at paddle shifts, but they said, no, we want the stick shift for sequential shift. And it's the incredible thing is that in the first sector alone, I think he was 0.4 up. And he was getting Neil Crompton excited and over the top of the mountain. And you have to be very careful, I think, exiting McPhillamy Park onto Skyline, not to run too wide, but sort of run over the curb a little bit. But the great thing was, the best part of a lap I love, of many parts, is when he's going over Skyline and you can hear him on the limiter going down through the gears. You can hear him as he goes across Skyline.
Well, he buzzed it, didn't he?
He doesn't. But I don't know if he buzzed it of what you mean, buzzed it as in damaged the engine.
Well, no, he put it in the wrong gear. So as he went down through the cutting, because he said it in the interview afterwards, and then in subsequent interviews he's come out with since, as he was going through the cutting, he hooked first instead of third. Because, of course, H-pattern gearbox, it's a dog box. They're really close together. And he went from fourth to first, and he very quickly realised it and got it straight into third and barely lost any time.
Yeah, because if you hear very carefully, as he's going over Skyline, you hear like he's fully on the rev limiter, like he's properly into the red on the end of the revs. And so you think that's just him just literally just pushing down through the gears really quickly to kind of get it slowed down. But if that's the case, that he literally pulled a gear and almost damaged it, then that makes it even more incredible. And then by the time he gets to the exit of Forest Elbow and end of the second split, he's up by 0.7. And the great thing is that you see him going off, and the next camera shot is just looking at John Bow, he's
just like that.
He's got his he's got the fast slap, and he's looking at the TV screen, just literally laughing, and the comms are going, all you can do is laugh. And yeah, it's a lap that no matter how many times I see it, for what part of it, if it's all of it or part of it, it never fails to give me goosebumps. It never fails to make the hairs on my arm stand on end, because it's just such an electric lap. The only other one that comes close to that, I think, would be Scotty McLaughlin's lap in. You have to fill in the name of the year for me, but
2017.
Yeah, that sounds about right. When he was still in supercars in the Shell Mustang, in the Gen 2 car. And yeah, that sort of lap was pretty incredible too. And even then, he made a mistake on that lap too. And just both of those laps are as special as each other. But there's just something about, in terms of the laps of the gods, I think, what's the phrase? You never forget your first. That was the first proper lap of the gods. And I think that as great as Scotty McLaughlin's lap was, and others that have been quicker in the past and gone quicker in laps, that was the first one that everyone took notice and went, quite literally when the sun comes, holy smokes, that's a lap and a half. So that was certainly one to remember. And the celebration afterwards, when Greg was absolutely beside himself, and you can hear him in the car, it just made everything. It's one of those moments where if you're a motorsport fan and you want to talk about, you probably need more than 4 to choose from. I'm talking about like a motorsport moments Mount Rushmore in terms of things like that. There's big things, but in terms of this, at least in the world of Australian motorsport, that's one of the most memorable things in Australian motorsport that Greg Murphy did there. And he went into that kind of uncharted waters of, this is how quickly these cars can go around this mountain. This is how well this car is sorted, and this is how fast I can go.
Yeah, it's and the fact that he went on to win the race that year and then win in 2004 as well. He never won the championship, Greg Murphy, but he is a 4 times Bathurst winner. Famously, he won it in 1996 with Craig Lowndes. He then won it again, I think it was at 99 with Stephen Richards, and then the 2003-2004, including that lap of the gods, arguably when the V8 Supercar Championship was at its highest ebb. You had so many great drivers, so many great teams in there, full manufacturer backing from Holden, supporting so many teams. The same with Ford. You had Walkinshaws with HRT and what was Kmart. So Greg Murphy was sort of under the Walkinshaw umbrella. You had Castrol Perkins Racing as well. Larry Perkins' team, I think 2003 was actually his last Bathurst that he did that year. And on the Ford side, you have Ford Performance Racing. You had what was the first year of Triple Eight Racing as Roland Dane came over.
Stone Brothers.
Yeah, Stone Brothers, Marcus Ambrose, Russell Ingall, that never really went well at Bathurst.
No, abiding memory I've got of Ambrose at Bathurst, I think you might know where I'm going with this. Lap of the Gods was 2003. I'm talking 2 years later, 2005.
The track is jammed. The track is jammed.
And ironically, it involved Murphy.
Murphy
in the super cheap car, and it's not just the incident. And to be fair, you look at the incident, and it's a bit of a shocker. But there's a legitimate moment where you almost think
he's going.
Christ,
he's going over the fence.
He's going over the fence and into the bush. He's literally going across because he rides the wall.
Yeah,
the back end of the car rides the wall, and then it's interesting. You look at the aftermath of the accident, and you can see that the front end is quite smashed, and ironically, Murphy drives past, and as he goes past, he clips the front bumper, and that's what takes
it off. Yeah,
but ironically, you look at Murphy's car, and this is something that you can't see on the rear. That car doesn't look as damaged.
Supposedly, there was he thought. Well, his words again. Listening to old interviews, he knew it was stuffed. It was buggered. Apparently, the steering was gone.
Right.
So whether as a fact, so he parts it here, and then of course it's the classic reaction. Ambrose gets out, walks, and these two did not like each other at the time.
Yeah,
they'd had a lot of clashes. They clashed at the Gold Coast a year before. Marcus Ambrose was at his height. He was a double champion. Murphy had won both the Bathursts. It was Ford versus Holden. Bang, bang, bang. The clash of ideologies out there. It was peak supercars at peak Bathurst for me.
Yeah. And the great thing was, I think it was something along the lines of, I think sort of Ambrose got out, immediately looked at Murphy and gave him the
what the hell?
Cross your arms like that, but they gave him the up your sign. Murphy starts pointing no, it's your fault. And the great thing is they're both kind of take their helmets and their balaclavas off. And you see them for a good 10, 15 seconds basically just having it out with each other. Not an actual physical fight, but just arguing with each other and just saying, look, what the hell?
It's just all expletives.
Pretty much, yeah. You'd love to have had them mic'd up for that to happen, but of course, I guess unless they tell it in interviews, we'll never know exactly what was said. And there was a point where literally it looks as though they were going to have to stop the race because the circuit was pretty well jammed, and towards the end of the incident, there was cars properly piling into each other, and it's like a proper concertina effect in terms of one coming in after the other. But thankfully, regardless of all the damaged cars, there was a path clear that allowed to carry on and make it happen. So that was just.
And that race was absolutely phenomenal in itself because, of course, it was Craig Lowndes' first year with Triple Eight in the Falcon, the better electrical car. He was leading quite early on, and then he had the wheel.
Yes.
He had the wheel hit his screen, and that took him out. And then you had more drama with Ambrose because, of course, he was trying to make, when he had the altercation with Murphy, he was making his way back up through the field because of Balaclava Gate.
Oh, was it that year?
It was
the year before.
it was that year, because it was during that race, and it was during the time V8 Supercars was evolving and becoming more of an international championship in terms of its prestige and everything. And it was decided, I think it was that year, they had to conform to FIA rules, which meant they had to have balaclavas. Whereas at the domestic races, so the Bathurst 1000 was kind of run to FIA rules, whereas the domestic races at other rounds were local Australian rules. The Aussie rules sort of dictated you didn't have to wear a balaclava. At the Bathurst 1000, you did, and him and Russell Ingall. So he was obviously asked by his team engineer, have you got a balaclava on? Yes, I believe I have. Marcus, tell me, have you got your balaclava on? And they're all trying to guess on the telecast, because obviously he's got his suit done up and he's got a full face helmet. And just, he had to come in, and there's the famous image of him coming in during the pit stop, and he lifts his helmet up and they're just struggling to get and he has a strop, goes out the building, like, right, you want to check every other car in the field. And then Russell Ingall comes in for a suspicious pit stop, possibly to sort the same thing. But that was
I missed that bit.
Well, that was peak supercars for me. And then because you've got 2006 as well, the drama on the first lap with Mark Scaife, the favourite for the race, gets taken out by Jack Perkins 2 corners in. Yeah. The whole occasion is a massive emotional occasion anyway, because of course they'd lost Peter Brock weeks before, leading up to it, and Craig Lowndes was in a very emotional place just before the race, and then he goes and wins the race. That's the first race where you are awarded the Peter Brock Trophy. Magical, absolutely magical.
Yeah, and I remember there was a special parade that they ran. I think he ran in. I think Lowndes drove Brock's. It was either his Tirana or one of his.
I think it was his Tirana, yeah.
And he drove it around. That was quite emotional. I think he got out and he saw Peter's widow, and essentially had a moment with her where he kind of gave her a hug and started to get emotional, which you understand, because when you've been around someone like that who's been your mentor, who's been the person that you look up to and has shown you the ropes, and you've even gone as far as winning races. And I want to say they won Bathurst. I don't think they did, but
no.
But the fact that they were teammates, that Peter that Craig learnt so much from Peter, and the fact that he passed away, and it doesn't make it any easier. And I'm not obviously excusing the reason why he did, but obviously, Brock, for context, he passed away when he was taking part in the Targa Tasmania, and it was a replica of a Daytona Cobra Coupe.
Yeah.
I guess those would argue that if anyone's going to go, and not to excuse it at all, make a light of it at all whatsoever,
you go doing something you love.
If you're going to go, then that's kind of, I guess, the way if you're going to choose it, that's the way you want to go in terms of motorsport. But ultimately, no one wants to go, even in that way. And so it was a hard loss for everyone to have to take in the supercars paddock, and particularly for Craig. And so to be able to make it happen, and even to see the emotion when the camera went to the in-car view, to see him just gently lift his visor up and think,
and you see the tears.
Yeah, even just like resting his head to one side, like, I've just achieved that based on what everything's happened before. So, and no doubt in some cases, some shape or form, I'm not really a religious or even a spiritual person too much, but I'm sure Brock was with him that day, thinking, right, let's, for everything you've done for me to allow you to support you and vice versa, here's a bit of a helping hand. Here you go. Yeah. Let's make sure we get this done. So, yeah.
And I think any other race to top that off, I talk about peak supercars being sort of early 2000s going into the mid 2000s, but for me, arguably, it could be any time from 1998 through to sort of 2016, 2015, 2016. 2014, I watched that race live on what was Motors TV back then. I watched the conclusion of that race, and I was on the end of my sofa. To win Bathurst on the last lap, having not led a lap, and to start at the back, and for, it talks about it being Mostert's race. Paul Morris, his co-driver Paul Morris, he's won the Bathurst 500. He then won the 1000. He'd won the 24 hours. That was the jewel in the crown for Paul Morris. He was arguably emotional with that, but that is probably the greatest last 20 laps of any motor race in history.
That was pretty extraordinary, and it all came down to, well, essentially the fuel strategy. When Whincup was pushing along, and I don't know if he had a radio communication problem or whether it was simply him just wanted to get his head down. He was in the zone, and for some reason he just didn't hear what his engineer was saying. But they were literally almost practically screaming to Whincup on the phone.
Save fuel.
It's that save fuel is saying, if you don't back off, then we're not going to win this race. But ultimately, if he did back off, he wasn't going to win it anyway because Mostert was charging that pretty hard. So ultimately, it was a lose-lose situation. So I think Whincup probably had the attitude of, well, yeah, you can make me go slower and get to the point where I'm going to back off and make it to the end on all the fuel I've got, or I've just got to go for broke and just see what happens. And then if it works out in my favour, it does. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And I think one of the telltale shots I remember of that sequence, so when the pass happens, not long after it happens, it's literally just a shot of Paul Dumbrell sat there with his face expression, like his expression kind of like, yeah, ain't happened today.
Yeah, yeah. And again, like races previously that we've discussed, like 2005, there was so much that happened leading up to that point. Shane van Gisbergen led most of that race in the Techno Commodore, the VIP Pet Foods, the yellow and black car. Looked a beautiful car, and Shane van Gisbergen, he was very much a young gun then, and he was so quick in that car. He was quick all day, and he went in, did a pit stop, went to fire it up, and the map was wrong, so it just flooded the engine. So it just click, and it hydraulic locked the motor. So they had to undo the plugs, and that was it. A Bathurst gone, and you saw the heartbreak there, and everyone's on the edge of their seat. And then you get the safety car restart. Mark Winterbottom's, Frosty. This is prime Frosty, Ford factory driver, Ford Performance Racing. Mozzie's teammate. I mean, Mozzie was the second driver at Ford. He wasn't the main driver. Mostert was kind of there in the background, and it was Craig Lowndes, Mark Winterbottom, and Jamie Whincup going for this Bathurst. Again, peak 888 Holden racing team versus FPR, Ford Falcon factory team, going head-to-head, butting heads. Craig Lowndes then hits Mark Winterbottom, spins him out. That takes out Frosty, knocks him back. Then Craig Lowndes gets the penalty for doing it, and then there was two. And this all happens in this crescendo that then leads up to Jamie Whincup has got the lead, Mostert in the background. You could see the blue lights. He's charging it down on him. He wants to get to him. And then in the last 3 laps, you just hear the radio call. Jamie, for God's sake, please, you're going to have to go to reserve. And even on the last lap, they were saying to him, reserve it going up the hill so you've got everything going into the chase.
Yeah, but realistically, how much would he have been able to hold off Chaz in that section on the uphill part? I don't think he would have done anyway.
No.
It obviously got close, obviously, but at the same time, Chaz would have been, to use a David Addison term, all over him like a cheap suit, which he was by that point. So it's just, and what is interesting at that point is that if you even look on the Supercars YouTube of the thumbnail, I think that loaded the full race from like 3 years ago.
Yeah.
The thumbnail literally says the greatest, and the greatest is in red text, the greatest great race ever. So even Supercars recognised 2014 and that finish as beyond any others that have existed. And there have been some great ones, but that's essentially an official acknowledgement by Supercars themselves that they class that finish and that Bathurst as the greatest Bathurst that has taken place since it began. So that says a lot about how memorable it is. I mean, also you think about this as well. I just looking here a little bit. So there's two little videos. One about the on YouTube about the literally the final 2 or 3 laps. You've then got the full race, which is 8 hours long to watch if you've got 8 hours to kill in a day. You've then got the video which Josh Revell did on it being the greatest motor race ever, and just how popular it is, and how his videos work out on top of that. His video has 1.3 million views about that race alone. And that is more than both of those Supercars videos, the full race and the 5 minutes at the end of that race combined.
His videos are very good.
Yeah, so it's and even ironically 9 days ago, the day of recording this, which is October 7th, Supercars have put another edit out, which is the last 10 laps of that race, and even that's had, I say only, but 31k views. So it's one of those ones where people are not going to tire watching it, because it came down to the end of quite a simple contest, as it always tends to be when it comes to Bathurst. It was just Ford versus Holden, two cars, whichever one made it to the flag first past the post got the victory. As simple as that. Yes, there was the fuel element of it, but ultimately one of them has to set the checkered flag first. Which one it was going to be, it was just down to them to slug it out and decide what happened. And in the end, the Holden coughed. Must have made the pass where he sort of just gently, let's say, eased him out of the way at Forest.
Gave him a little nudge.
Yeah, and then just powered his way past. And then what I also love at the end as well is he comes out the final corner. You can tell he's properly put the boot down, because the car's just all over he's the place, just
absolutely sent it. Yeah,
it's incredible. So yeah, there's been some incredible finishes and incredible motor races over the years. I have to agree, in terms of finishes, it's definitely up there with one of the best motor races. I have to agree, it is the best Bathurst of all time. In terms of finish, I think it's one of the best races in Australian motorsport history, and it's genuinely one of the best races, I think, best race finishes I think that you'll ever see. And if you want maybe a video, even just the last handful of laps of what is Australian supercars, I think that 5 minutes and 28 seconds on that video, which you can find it on the Supercars page, that pretty much tells you everything that you need to know. It might only be two cars, it might be the last 3 laps or so, but it'll still tell you everything about what Supercars is all about.
And what a great place to end this show on, Scott. A fantastic Bathurst 2014. Well, we don't know who is going to win the race this weekend. We're releasing this on the Friday morning as we recorded this on Monday, the 7th of October. So we're going to be eagerly awaiting the results this weekend. I'm going to be watching it from a beach in Greece, which is quite nice. I don't know where you're going to be watching it from, Scott, whether it's going to be at home or you got anything nice planned, but...
well, I'm going to be at Silverstone this weekend, because we've got a finals weekend for BRSCC for several championships. So that race is going to take place pretty much in the early hours of Sunday morning. So I'll probably only catch the result of it as I'm waking up to start the day to see some championships provisionally sealed. So I'll only see the results of that or the end of it pretty much as I'm starting my day. But it might be a nice thing to wake up to see if I might have to wake up and see what chaos or what sort of straightforward race it's been, or it's been absolutely chaotic. And I don't think anything can fully top or match what 2014 did. It's going to have to go some way a race is going to have to go some way in Bathurst to beat that. But whether it gets anywhere near that or just gives us a good spectacle and a good motor race, I guess we'll have to wait and see. I mean, look at the weather forecast. It's not expected to rain. Touch wood. I think I've seen the weather forecast looking at it is about maybe a high of 20, 21 degrees, and only about a 30% chance of rain or so on Sunday.
Yeah.
So if anything, it might be a tiny bit of cloudy, but apart from that, it should be clear and dry. So it should be, there'll still be moments where there might be safety cars and stuff and things that happen. But all in all, if things stay as they should, track conditions wise, it should be hopefully a pretty straightforward, but a pretty entertaining Bathurst, as it always tends to be. So yeah, it's always a bit of a mix up and an unknown. Nothing's ever guaranteed in motorsport, especially not at Bathurst. So all we can do is just wish everyone the best of luck, see what happens, and someone's going to come out of it with the Peter Brock Trophy for 2024. But who it is, I guess we'll find out as you listen to this in about 48 hours' time.
And you never know, there might be a kangaroo or an echidna thrown into the mix, as is in previous years. But for this Bathurst special, my thanks to Scott Woodwiss. Thanks for joining me, Scott, for this episode of the Driving Talk podcast. We're going to be having a bit of a break, probably another week or so before we release another one of these. And then at some point, I'm going to pop up to Max's abode to sit down, have a chat with Max and go through the goings on in 2024. But for now, from the Driving Talk podcast, I've been Robert Lewis and with Scott Woodwiss. Bye for now.